The Baroness's estate sat on a rise of blackened earth, where the grass never seemed to grow soft and the air always carried the smell of iron and wet stone. Long before the sun began to fall, whispers moved through the servants' quarters like a cold draught slipping under doors. Something was coming. It was always that way when the Baroness grew bored. Boredom, in her world, was more dangerous than anger. Anger burned fast and passed, but boredom demanded entertainment, and entertainment often meant blood. The slave was taken just after midday. He had been working near the outer wall, his hands raw from hauling stone, his back bent not only by labor, but by years of learned silence. He was not special. That was the cruel irony. He had not tried to run, had not spoken out of turn, had not even looked at the Baroness when she rode past that morning. Yet when her eyes drifted over the line of workers, they stopped on him, lingering for a moment too long. She tilted her head slightly, as if examining a dull object and imagining how it might be broken into something more interesting. By late afternoon, guards came for him. They did not explain why. They never did. Iron fingers closed around his arms, not roughly, not kindly either, but with the practiced indifference reserved for livestock. The other slaves lowered their eyes. Some whispered prayers. Others turned their backs, pretending not to see, because seeing meant remembering, and remembering meant fear. He did not resist. Resistance only fed the games. They marched him through corridors he had never been allowed to enter before. The stone beneath his feet was cleaner here, smoother, worn down by the passing of fine boots instead of bare skin. Torches lined the walls, even though daylight still poured in through narrow windows, their flames hissing softly, impatient for night. With every step, the air seemed to tighten around his chest, as if the house itself knew what was about to happen and leaned in to watch. The courtyard lay at the heart of the estate, hidden from the world by walls so high they erased the sky. It was a place rarely used, reserved for punishments meant to be remembered. The ground was packed dirt, dark and uneven, stained by old rain and older secrets. Along one wall, thick iron rings were embedded in the stone, rusted but strong, relics of past lessons. On the opposite side stood a heavy gate reinforced with bars, leading to a narrow tunnel that disappeared into shadow. The Baroness arrived as the sun began its slow descent, painting the upper edges of the walls with fading gold. She wore black, as she often did, not because she mourned anything, but because it made the red stand out more clearly when it came. Her presence changed the temperature of the space. Conversations stopped. Breathing grew shallow. Even the guards straightened, their eyes fixed forward, knowing better than to meet her gaze unless summoned. She descended from her horse with graceful precision, handing the reins to a servant who trembled as though the leather burned. Her boots made no sound on the dirt as she crossed the courtyard, yet every step felt loud, echoing in the slave's chest. She studied him openly now, circling slowly, as one might inspect a piece of meat at market. Her eyes were sharp, curious, disappointed and pleased all at once. "So this is him," she said softly, though there was no one she needed to speak to. Her voice carried easily, smooth as silk dragged across a blade. "He looks smaller than I imagined." The guards pushed the slave forward. He stumbled, caught himself and stood still, his wrists already bound. He kept his eyes low, focused on the ground, tracing the cracks and stains, anything to avoid her face. He could feel her attention like a weight pressing down on his spine. She gestured, and a servant hurried forward with a tray. On it lay a thin leather collar, reinforced with metal studs, worn smooth by use. The Baroness picked it up, testing its weight, then nodded once. The collar was fastened around the slave's neck, snug but not choking. It was not meant to kill him, not yet. It was meant to remind him, and everyone watching, of what he was. As the last of the sunlight slid down the walls, a low sound rolled through the courtyard, barely audible at first. A growl, then another. From the tunnel beyond the gate came the scraping of claws against stone, the impatient shifting of heavy bodies. The dogs knew the routine, they always did. The sound alone was enough to make seasoned guards swallow hard. 7 of them waited behind that gate. Everyone on the estate knew the stories. They were not ordinary hunting dogs. They had been raised on raw meat and cruelty, trained to respond to pain with fury, taught that the scent of fear was a command. Each bore scars from past fights, from whips, from chains. They were weapons with teeth, sharpened by years of deliberate neglect. The Baroness turned toward the gate, her expression almost fond. "You've been fed," she called out, though no one could hear her beyond the bars. "But not enough." A servant approached, pale and shaking, holding a torch. At her signal, he moved to the mechanism that held the gate closed. The courtyard seemed to shrink as everyone leaned back instinctively, creating distance between themselves and what was about to be unleashed. Somewhere above, a window creaked as someone closed it, unable to watch. Before the gate was opened, the Baroness raised one gloved hand. The servant froze. She turned back to the slave, lifting his chin with a single finger, so that at last he had no choice but to look at her. Her eyes were calm, almost bored. "Run," she said. It was not a command meant to help him. It was part of the performance. "Scream if you like. I find it makes things more satisfying." She stepped back, dust barely stirring beneath her boots, and lowered her hand. The gate swung open. The sound that followed was explosive. 7 bodies surged forward, muscles coiling and releasing in violent harmony. Their snarls filled the courtyard, echoing off the stone until it felt like the walls themselves were screaming. Saliva dripped from bared teeth. Eyes locked onto the lone figure in the center like arrows finding a target. For a heartbeat, the slave's body reacted on instinct. His muscles tightened, breath caught in his throat, and every memory of pain screamed at him to move, to flee, to do anything but stand still. The dogs fanned out, circling, cutting off. Imagined escape routes. Dust kicked up beneath their paws, hanging in the air like smoke. From the balcony above, nobles leaned forward, anticipation sharpening their smiles. This was the moment they had come for. This was the proof of the Baroness's power, the reminder that nothing on her land lived or died without her permission. The slave took one step back, then stopped. Something inside him settled, heavy and cold, like a stone sinking into deep water. He understood suddenly that running would only prolong the inevitable. He had seen others run. He had heard their screams echo long after their bodies were carried away. Fear fed the dogs, panic excited them. Every frantic movement was an invitation, so he did the one thing no one expected. He stood his ground. The dogs slowed, confused by the lack of chaos. Their growls deepened, uncertain, as they adjusted their circle. One lunged forward, stopping just short, snapping its jaws inches from his leg. The sound was deafening, meant to break him. He did not flinch. His hands trembled, but he forced them still, pressing his fingers into his palms until pain anchored him. The Baroness frowned slightly. It was a small thing, easily missed, but those closest to her saw it and felt a chill. This was not how it was supposed to go. She had wanted terror, a spectacle of desperation. Instead, she was watching something quieter, something she could not immediately name. "Interesting," she murmured, more to herself than anyone. Else. The sun finally disappeared beyond the walls, leaving the courtyard bathed in torchlight and shadow. The dogs continued to circle, their movements restless but hesitant, as if waiting for a signal that never came. The slave's breath slowed despite the pounding of his heart. He could feel their heat, smell their breath, hear the scrape of claws against dirt. Death was close enough to touch, yet it did not rush him. For the first time that evening, the Baroness leaned forward, truly paying attention. What had been meant as a simple cruelty was beginning to stretch into something else, something unpredictable. And unpredictability, in her world, was dangerous. The challenge had been set, not by words or weapons, but by silence. And as the dogs continued to circle under the fading light, the courtyard held its breath, unaware that the game the Baroness believed she controlled had already begun to slip from her grasp. The first full minute passed without blood, and that alone felt unnatural. Time stretched in strange ways inside the courtyard, each second heavy enough to be counted by breath and heartbeat. The dogs continued their slow orbit, paws pressing into the dirt with deliberate rhythm, their bodies low, ready to spring. Their eyes never left the slave. Every instinct they had been trained into screamed that he should be running, flailing, begging. Yet he stood there, a single still shape in a circle of moving death, and the contradiction unsettled them. One dog broke formation and stepped closer, its lips pulled back to reveal yellowed teeth worn down by bone. It snapped at the air again, louder this time, saliva spraying across the slave's leg. The sound echoed sharply, causing a ripple of excitement through the others. They surged forward a half step, hackles rising, tails stiff. This was usually the moment when screams erupted, when panic filled the space and the hunt truly began. The slave's heart hammered so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. His chest burned with the urge to flee, to do anything but remain where he was. Every scar on his body remembered what came next. But layered beneath that terror was another memory, older and quieter. Long before chains, before whips, before the Baroness's land had become his whole world, there had been nights like this. Nights when hunger drove wild dogs into the outskirts of his village, when children were taught not to run, not to scream, but to stand together, to make themselves known without becoming prey. He swallowed and forced air into his lungs, slow and controlled. The smell of the dogs was strong now, wet fur, old blood, something sour and desperate beneath it. He could see the scars along their bodies, the missing patches of hair, the way one limped slightly as it moved. These were not creatures born cruel. They had been shaped, beaten into weapons the same way he had been beaten into obedience. Another dog lunged, this time brushing against him, its shoulder slamming, lightly into his thigh. The impact nearly knocked him off balance. A collective gasp rose from the watching crowd. Several guards tightened their grips on their spears, ready for chaos. The Baroness's eyes gleamed, expecting the moment to finally break. Instead, the slave steadied himself and did something that felt almost impossible. He lowered his gaze, not in submission to the Baroness, but to the dogs. He avoided staring into their eyes, avoiding the challenge such a stare might represent. His hands, still bound, relaxed as much as they could. He shifted his weight, grounding himself, and softened his posture. It was a fragile calculation, balanced on the edge of death. Any wrong movement could trigger the attack he was trying to prevent. The dogs hesitated again. Their growls did not stop, but they changed, losing some of their sharpness. Confusion rippled through the pack. This was not the language they had been trained to understand. Pain, fear, running, those were commands. Stillness was not. One of the larger dogs, its muzzle scarred and one ear torn, stepped closer than the others. It sniffed at the air around the slave's chest, then lowered its head slightly, inhaling again. The slave could feel its breath against his skin, hot and damp. His knees threatened to buckle, but he held them steady through sheer will. He began to speak. At first the words barely rose above a whisper, swallowed by the growls and the murmurs of the crowd. They were not commands. Hey were not prayers, they were fragments of sound, broken syllables shaped more by breath than meaning, the same sounds he had once used to soothe frightened animals before he himself had become one. The effect was subtle, but it was there. The dog's head tilted. Its ears twitched, reacting not to the words but to the tone, the absence of threat. Another dog crept closer, curiosity overcoming aggression. It sniffed at his legs, then backed away, uncertain. From her place near the gate, the Baroness straightened, her fingers tightened around the edge of her cloak. This was not part of the design. She had seen men beg, fight, freeze, collapse. She had never seen one speak to the dogs like this, as if they were something other than tools. "Enough," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the noise. But no one moved. The guards hesitated, unsure whether the command was meant for them or for the animals. The dogs continued to circle, but the distance between them and the slave began to shrink. Their movements slowed, less synchronized now, each reacting to its own instincts rather than the pack's momentum. One sat back on its haunches briefly before catching itself and standing again, embarrassed by the instinct it could not fully suppress. The slave felt sweat trickle down his spine, cold despite the heat of the courtyard. His legs ached from tension. His arms throbbed where the ropes bit into his wrists. Still he continued the soft murmuring, keeping his breathing his presence steady. He was no longer performing for the Baroness or the crowd. He was focused entirely on the space between himself and the dogs, on maintaining the fragile thread of calm that seemed to hold them at bay. Memories flickered through his mind, uninvited but useful. He remembered being thrown into a pen years ago, injured and barely conscious, left among animals meant to frighten him. He had learned then that fear had a scent and that predators could taste it. He had learned how to bury it, how to let something else rise to the surface instead. Resignation, patience, a strange, quiet empathy. The dogs sensed it. One by one their snarls faded into low, uncertain rumbles. Their teeth remained bared, but the intention behind them softened, shifting from hunger to assessment. They were no longer certain that he was prey. Above, the murmuring crowd fell into an uneasy silence. This was no longer entertainment. It was something closer to witnessing a boundary being tested and possibly crossed. The torches flickered, casting distorted shadows of man and beast across the stone walls, blending them together until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. The Baroness felt a flicker of irritation bloom into anger. She had not invited doubt into her courtyard. She had not summoned these people to watch uncertainty. Her jaw tightened and she took a step forward, boots crunching against dirt. The sound echoed loudly, breaking the fragile balance. At once, several dogs snapped back into alertness, their heads turning toward her. The slave felt the shift immediately, like a tightening of air. He adjusted, lowering his body slightly, making himself smaller, less significant. His voice dropped even further, nearly silent now, more vibration than sound. The largest dog glanced between the Baroness and the slave, torn between conditioning and instinct. Its tail twitched. It growled once, deep and conflicted. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the dog took a step back. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it sent a shock through the courtyard. A ripple of disbelief passed through the onlookers. The guards exchanged quick glances. No one spoke. The Baroness froze, her expression hardening as if carved from stone. Another dog followed suit, breaking the circle and moving a short distance away. Its growl faded into silence. The pack's unity fractured, replaced by individual hesitation. They no longer advanced, they no longer lunged, they watched. The slave's lungs burned, but relief threatened to weaken him, and he fought it down. This was not safety, not yet. Any sudden change could still turn the moment violent. He remained where he was, balanced between terror and calm, fully aware that one mistake would end everything. He lifted his head slightly now, just enough to look at the dogs without challenging them. His eyes were tired, empty of resistance, yet not pleading. In them was recognition, a shared understanding of captivity, of pain imposed by hands that claimed ownership. The dogs saw it. The courtyard, once designed as a stage for cruelty, had become something else entirely, a quiet standoff, a test not of strength, but of will and perception. The Baroness, who had believed she controlled every outcome, found herself watching a scene she could not command, her authority strained by a silence more powerful than any scream. As the torchlight flickered and the night deepened, the second phase of her cruel game slipped further from her grasp. What had begun as a display of dominance was transforming into a moment of unsettling possibility, and in the center of it all stood a slave who had not moved, had not run, and had not broken, surrounded by 7 beasts who were no longer sure they had been sent to kill. The silence that settled over the courtyard was not peaceful. It was tense, stretched thin like a wire pulled too tight, humming with the promise of sudden violence. The dogs no longer circled in unison. Their formation had collapsed into something looser, uncertain, each animal now guided less by training and more by instinct. The slave stood among them, as if at the center of a broken storm, feeling every shift of muscle, every flick of an ear, every breath drawn too sharply. He could sense it before he fully understood it. The dogs were listening. Not to the Baroness, not to the guards or the murmuring crowd above. They were listening to him, not to his words, be. To the space he held, the quiet he carried inside himself, his voice, barely audible now, rose and fell in a low rhythm that matched his breathing. It was not language in the way humans used it. It was closer to a lullaby, stripped of melody, a vibration meant to soothe rather than instruct. One of the dogs, smaller than the others but lean and sharp-eyed, crept closer again. Its steps were cautious, almost delicate, claws barely disturbing the dirt. It stopped a few feet away and lowered its head, sniffing not at the slave's legs this time, but at the ground, as if searching for something familiar. The slave felt his throat tighten. He did not move. He did not reach out. He allowed the dog to choose. The animal lifted its head slowly and met his eyes. It was the first time any of them had done that without hostility. The gaze held no challenge, no promise of attack. There was wariness there, yes, but also recognition. The slave's breath caught for a fraction of a second before he forced himself to exhale again, slow and steady. He let his shoulders relax just a little more, offering openness instead of threat. Images flickered through his mind, unbidden, a younger version of himself kneeling beside a sick goat, whispering softly while his mother worked to bind a wound. The memory of being beaten for wasting time on animals instead of labor. The realization, learned the hard way, that suffering created strange kinships. Pain recognized pain. The dog took another step. Forward. A low murmur rippled through the spectators. Some leaned closer to the railing, unable to look away. Others shifted uneasily, sensing that what they were witnessing was no longer entertainment but something intimate and unsettling. The guards tightened their grips again, caught between anticipation and fear. The Baroness felt a prickle of irritation sharpen into something colder. Her eyes narrowed, tracking the movement of the dog with surgical focus. This was not obedience. This was not training. This was defiance of a subtler kind, born not of rebellion but of choice, and choice was a dangerous thing to allow. "Get back!" she snapped, her voice cracking across the courtyard like a whip. The dog flinched, but did not retreat. That single moment sent a shock through the space. The Baroness's authority had always been absolute. Even the animals responded to her tone, her presence, the promise of reward or punishment. Yet now one of her prized weapons hesitated, torn between an old conditioning and a new, unfamiliar pull. The slave felt the shift immediately. The sound of her voice tightened the air, threatening to shatter the fragile calm he had built. He adjusted instinctively, lowering himself further, bending his knees until he was almost crouching. His head bowed slightly, not in submission to her, but to keep his presence non-threatening to the dogs. His murmuring changed, becoming softer still, his voice vibrating more in his chest than in his throat. It was as exhausting to maintain this careful balance. His muscles trembled from strain. Sweat ran down his temples, stinging his eyes. Still, he did not stop. Another dog approached. This one was older, its muzzle grayed, its movements slower but more deliberate. Scars crisscrossed its shoulders, old and poorly healed. It limped faintly, favoring one hind leg. As it came closer, it let out a low sound, not a growl, not a bark, but something in between. A question. The slave felt an unexpected ache bloom in his chest. He recognized that sound. He had made it himself once, in the dark, when no one could hear him, and he allowed himself the smallest expression of pain. The dog stopped just in front of him and sat. The courtyard froze. The sound of fabric rustling, of breath being drawn, seemed impossibly loud. A guard cursed under his breath. Someone laughed nervously, then stopped when no one else joined in. The Baroness did not move. Her face remained composed, but her eyes burned. The slave nearly lost his balance then, not physically but emotionally. The act was so simple, so small, yet it struck him with unexpected force. Sitting was not surrender, but it was trust. The dog had chosen stillness over violence, restraint over command. Slowly, carefully, the slave shifted his weight and lowered himself further until he was kneeling in the dirt. His bound hands rested against his thighs. His head remained bowed. He allowed the dogs to see him smaller now, less imposing, less like prey and less like threat. Simply present. One by one, the others drew closer. They did not rush. They did not snap. They approached in hesitant arcs, stopping and starting, sniffing the air, the ground, each other. Their growls faded entirely, replaced by soft huffs and the sound of breathing. One brushed past his shoulder, close enough that he felt the roughness of its fur against his skin. Another paused behind him, then lay down, its chin resting on its paws. The slave closed his eyes for a brief moment, anchoring himself. He knew better than to believe the danger had passed, but something fundamental had changed. The pack no longer saw him as an object to be destroyed. He was part of the space now, woven into their awareness. Above them, the torches flickered as if disturbed by an unseen wind. Shadows danced across the walls, transforming the scene into something almost unreal. Man and beast shared the same ground, breathing the same air, bound not by chains, but by a shared understanding that ran deeper than words. The Baroness felt a cold, creeping sensation climb her spine. This was wrong, not just unexpected, but wrong in a way she could not easily correct. She had designed this moment to reinforce her power, to remind everyone present that life and death bent at her will. Instead, she was witnessing a quiet rebellion, one she could not crush without exposing her own loss of control. She gestured sharply to the guards. "Enough of this," she said. "Open the G8." The command rang out, sharp and final. The guards hesitated, glancing between her and the scene before them. To open the gate now was to intervene, to disrupt something that felt fragile and volatile, yet disobedience was unthinkable. One of them moved toward the mechanism, his steps slow, reluctant. The sound of metal shifting echoed through the courtyard. At once, several dogs lifted their heads, alert. Tension rippled through their bodies, muscles tightening, ears pricking. The slave felt the change like a wave crashing into him. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself, and adjusted his posture again, subtly reasserting calm. The dogs looked to him. It was an instinctive thing, almost frightening in its simplicity. In this moment of uncertainty, they sought guidance not from the voice that had ruled them through fear, but from the presence that offered steadiness. The realization sent a chill through the watching crowd. Power was shifting, not through force but through trust. The gate creaked open a few inches. The Baroness stepped forward, her boots cutting decisive lines through the dirt. "Enough!" she repeated, louder now. "This has gone on long enough." The dogs did not move toward her. They stayed where they were, some standing, some sitting, some lying at the slave's side. Their bodies formed an uneven barrier around him, not aggressive but protective in their own quiet way. It was not loyalty as the Baroness understood it, born of punishment and reward. It was something else entirely. For the first time since the game had begun, doubt flickered openly across her face. The slave lifted his head then, just slightly, and opened his eyes. He did not look at the Baroness. He looked at the dogs around him, meeting their gazes one by one. His voice, still low and steady, carried a final, gentle vibration through the space. It was not a command to stay, it was an acknowledgement. They stayed anyway. The unseen bond had formed, not forged by dominance, but by shared wounds and mutual recognition. In the heart of the Baroness's courtyard, under the watchful eyes of those who believed power was only ever taken by force, a quiet truth had revealed itself. And in that truth lay something far more dangerous to her than rebellion, a loyalty she could not buy, break, or fully understand. The order to open the gates should have ended everything. It was the Baroness's voice, sharp and absolute, the same voice that had decided fates for decades without question. Normally, that single command would have shattered hesitation and restored the natural order of fear. But this time, the sound of metal shifting and the slow creak of the gate did not bring relief or resolution. It brought something far more dangerous, choice. As the gate widened, torchlight spilled into the narrow tunnel beyond, revealing darkness that stretched away like an open mouth. The guards stepped back instinctively, giving the opening space, expecting the dogs to surge forward, pulled by habit and hunger. Instead, they hesitated. Their heads turned not toward freedom or command, but inward, toward the slave at their center. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible yet unmistakable. The axis of attention had shifted. The Baroness noticed. Her expression tightened, a thin line drawn across her mouth. She took another step forward, boots striking the dirt with deliberate force. The sound echoed, louder than it should have been, as if the courtyard itself were amplifying her presence, trying to help her reclaim the moment. "Move," she said, not shouting, not pleading, but pressing the word into the air with practiced authority. One dog rose to its feet. The Baroness's eyes gleamed, certain the balance had tipped back in her favor. The dog did not advance. It stepped sideways instead, placing itself closer to the slave. Another followed, then another, bodies shifting into a loose, uneven line. Not aggressive, not snarling, but unmistakably positioned. The message was quiet but clear. Whatever this man was to them now, he was not something to be abandoned. A murmur swept through the onlookers like wind through dry leaves. This was no longer spectacle. It was defiance, witnessed by too many eyes to be dismissed as illusion. Guards exchanged looks, their training colliding with instinct. They were used to controlling chaos, not standing helpless as it reorganized itself. The slave felt the change before he saw it. The air around him seemed to thicken, heavy with attention. He had not planned this. He had not imagined escape or victory. All he had wanted was to survive the next breath, then the next. Yet here he was, standing at the center of something that felt impossibly larger than himself. His legs ached as he straightened slowly from his crouch. Every movement was careful, measured, mindful of how quickly calm could turn to violence. The dogs adjusted with him, rising or stepping back, just enough to maintain their quiet formation. One brushed against his leg, grounding him in the reality of warm fur and steady breath. The Baroness's patience snapped. "Take him," she ordered the guards, her voice cutting through the murmurs like glass. "Now!" Two guards stepped forward, spears angled low, their boots scraped against the dirt as they approached, eyes fixed on the slave, though their attention flickered nervously to the dogs flanking him. They had fought men before. They had fought animals before. They had never fought this, an unspoken alliance that rewrote the rules they understood. As the guards closed in, one of the dogs growled. It was not loud, it was not wild, it was controlled, resonant, vibrating through the ground like distant thunder. Another dog echoed it, then another, until the sound surrounded the guards from multiple directions. The spears wavered. Sweat beaded along foreheads. No one had given the dogs a command, yet they were responding as if they had. The Baroness raised her hand sharply, preparing to shout again, but something stopped her. For the first time she hesitated. She saw it then clearly. The dogs were no longer hers in this moment. Any order she gave might not be obeyed. Worse, it might be challenged. The slave took a step forward. The movement was small, unremarkable, yet it felt seismic. The dogs moved with him, not crowding, not lunging, simply accompanying. The guards froze, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. The slave's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained composed, his eyes forward. He did not look at the Baroness. He did not need to. He walked. Each step carried him closer to the open gate, closer to the edge of the courtyard that had been designed to be a dead end. Dust rose beneath his feet. The torches flickered violently, flames bending as if disturbed by the shift in power. The dogs followed, their paws falling into an unspoken rhythm with his stride. The Baroness felt something she had not felt in years tighten in her chest. Fear sharp and unwelcome. Not fear of violence, she had mastered that long ago, but fear of being seen failing, seen losing control in front of witnesses who would carr. Why the story far beyond these walls? "Stop him," she said, her voice lower now, edged with urgency. No one moved. The guards stood rigid, spears held but useless. The servants watched with wide eyes, some clutching each other, others frozen in place. The nobles on the balcony leaned back instinctively, as if distance might protect them from what they were witnessing. Authority, once absolute, was dissolving in real time. The slave reached the threshold of the gate. For a moment he paused. The darkness of the tunnel loomed before him, unknown and heavy with possibility. Behind him lay the courtyard, the Baroness, the life he had known since memory began. The dogs gathered close, forming a loose arc at his back. He felt their presence like a shield, not forged of steel but of shared resolve. Slowly he turned. At last his eyes met the Baroness's. There was no triumph in his gaze, no hatred, only clarity, the kind that comes from surviving something that was meant to break you and discovering in the aftermath that you are no longer what your captor imagined. The look unsettled her more than any defiance could have. It offered no challenge she could punish, no emotion she could manipulate. He said nothing. Then he stepped forward again, crossing the threshold. The dogs followed. One by one they moved through the gate, their bodies disappearing briefly into shadow before re-emerging on the other side, illuminated by torchlight. 7 shapes, 7 breaths, 7 live. No longer bound by the command that had once governed them. They did not glance back at the Baroness. Their attention remained fixed on the man leading them, as if he were a quiet star guiding their path. The sound of their paws echoed through the tunnel, steady and unhurried. Behind them the courtyard erupted, not in noise but in stunned stillness. The Baroness stood rigid, her hand half raised, her authority stranded in the space she no longer controlled. Around her, people began to breathe again, the release audible and collective. Some would later claim they had always known this could happen. Others would swear they had witnessed something impossible. The Baroness did not move to follow. She watched as the last dog vanished into the darkness, the echo of its steps fading slowly. The gate remained open, a silent accusation carved into stone. For the first time in her life, she was faced with a truth she could not punish away. Power taken through cruelty was fragile, and once broken, it did not easily return. The slave and the 7 dogs walked on, deeper into the tunnel, into uncertainty and night. He did not know where it led. He did not know what waited beyond. But for the first time, every step was his own, accompanied by creatures who had chosen him not because they were commanded to, but because they recognized something of themselves in his quiet strength. And in the courtyard behind them, the Baroness remained standing, surrounded by witnesses and walls, feeling the weight of a loss that no amount of punishment could undo. The night swallowed them gently, not with menace, but with a strange, open quiet that felt unreal after the torchlit cruelty of the courtyard. The tunnel opened onto a narrow service road beyond the estate walls, a place rarely used, where weeds pushed through cracked stone and the air smelled of damp earth instead of iron. The slave stepped into it slowly, half expecting the world to snap back into place, for a shout to come, for arrows or commands or punishment to rain down from behind. None did. He stopped only when the ground beneath his feet changed from stone to soil. The dogs halted with him, forming a loose semicircle, their bodies alert but no longer tense. For a long moment, no one moved. The night hummed with insects, distant and alive, a sound he realized he had not truly heard in years. His chest rose and fell deeply now, breath finally allowed to be breath instead of control. The collar still rested around his neck, heavy and cold, a reminder that the past did not vanish simply because one moment had ended. One of the dogs approached him first, the older one with the grey muzzle. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if asking permission. When it reached him, it lowered its head and pressed it gently against his leg. The contact was light, almost hesitant, but it carried weight. The slave's throat tightened. His bound hands trembled as he lowered them as far as the rope would allow, resting them against his knees. Another dog followed, then another, until all 7 were close, not crowding, not demanding, simply present. Their breathing filled the space around him, steady and warm. He realized then that he was no longer surrounded. He was accompanied. He sank down onto the cool earth, exhaustion finally claiming its due. The dogs adjusted immediately, some sitting, some lying down, one curling close enough that its fur brushed his arm. The slave stared up at the open sky above the walls, wide, scattered with stars, impossibly vast. He had forgotten how large the world could be when not framed by stone and command. Time passed in silence. When he finally moved again, it was with purpose. He worked his bound wrists against the rope, testing the knot. It had been tied quickly, carelessly, under the assumption that it would never need to be undone. One of the dogs watched him closely, head tilted, ears twitching with curiosity. The slave twisted and pulled, ignoring the burn in his skin until the fibers began to loosen. The moment the rope fell away, the dogs reacted, not with excitement, but with attention. They watched his hands as if recognizing the significance of the act. Freedom, even partial, carried a language all its own. He reached up and touched the collar. His fingers hesitated there. The metal was cold, familiar. It had marked him, reduced him, defined him for so long that removing it felt almost dangerous, as if he were stripping away the last proof of who he had been allowed to be. Slowly he unfastened it and let it fall to the ground. The sound it made, soft, dull, felt louder than any scream. None of the dogs flinched. One sniffed at the discarded collar briefly, then turned away, uninterested. The slave let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He placed a hand flat against the earth, grounding himself, reminding himself that this was real, that he was still alive. They did not linger near the estate. Instinct, or perhaps shared understanding, pushed them onward. The slave stood, brushing dirt from his clothes, and began to walk. The dogs fell into step beside him naturally, their pace adjusting to his without effort. No command was given, none was needed. As they moved farther into the countryside, the estate's looming presence faded behind them, swallowed by darkness and distance. The road narrowed into a rough path, then into nothing more than flattened grass. The land opened up, rolling gently beneath the stars. Somewhere in the distance, water flowed, its sound soft and inviting. With each step, the slave felt something inside him shift, not relief alone, but responsibility. These dogs were not weapons anymore. They were not tools. They were living, breathing beings who had chosen him in a moment that could not be undone. Whatever lay ahead, he would not walk it alone, and that knowledge carried both comfort and weight. At dawn, they reached a small clearing near a stream. Pale light crept across the horizon, washing the world in muted color. The dogs drank deeply, one after another, then sprawled in the grass, their bodies finally relaxing into sleep. The slave knelt at the water's edge, cupping it in his hands and drinking until the ache in his throat eased. He studied his reflection in the rippling surface. The face that stared back at him looked older than he remembered, carved by hardship and restraint. Yet there was something new there as well, an openness, a quiet steadiness he had not known he possessed. As the sun rose higher, he considered what came next. He could keep walking. He could disappear into the countryside, avoid villages, live quietly on the margins of the world. Or he could turn back, not to the Baroness, not to her land, but toward others like him. Others who still believed survival was the best they could hope for. The dog stirred as if sensing his thoughts. One lifted its head and looked at him, eyes calm and watchful. He reached out slowly, carefully, and rested his hand on its head. The dog did not pull away. It leaned into the touch. A decision settled in his chest, solid and unshakable. He would not hide. They moved again as the day grew warmer, traveling through fields and forest edges, skirting roads when voices or wagons approached. Word would spread, he knew. Stories always did. Some would say the dogs had been bewitched. Others would claim the Baroness had let him go as part of some twisted mercy. The truth, that power had slipped through her fingers because it was never truly hers to begin with, would be harder to accept. By nightfall, they reached a small abandoned structure near the edge of a wooded ridge. The roof sagged and the walls were cracked, but it offered shelter. The dog settled in easily, instinctively claiming the space. The slave sat near the entrance, watching the fireflies blink in the dark, feeling the world breathe around him. He thought of the Baroness then, standing alone in her courtyard, surrounded by walls and witnesses, but stripped of certainty. He did not feel satisfaction at the thought, only distance. Her power had depended on fear, and fear had limits. He had found one of them. In the days that followed, others would find him. Runaways first, drawn by whispers of a man who walked with 7 fierce dogs and did not carry a whip. They approached cautiously, eyes full of doubt and hope in equal measure. The dogs watched them closely, assessing, but did not bare their teeth. The slave spoke little, but when he did, his words were steady, grounded. He did not promise safety. He promised honesty. More came, and with them stories began to change. The Baroness's name, once spoken with dread, began to share space with another, one spoken softly, carefully, as if it might break if said too loudly. A man who had faced death and walked away with it at his side. A man who did not rule but guided. A man whose power was not taken but given. Years later, some would claim they had seen him still, moving along the edges of the world with his dogs, intervening where cruelty grew bold, vanishing before chains could be fastened. Others would swear he was only a story, exaggerated by time and need. But on quiet nights, when the wind carried distant howls across open land, people remembered. They remembered the night a Baroness lost control without a blow being struck. The night 7 vicious dogs chose something other than blood. The night power changed hands, not with violence but with recognition. And somewhere beyond walls and titles, a man walked freely beneath the stars, no longer defined by what had been done to him, but by what he had become.